decided to take the battles to the north, to try and bring some relief to Virginia, where so many of the major battles had taken place, and to bring the horrors of the war to the civilians there, possibly also strengthening the position of the peace Democrats who were actively trying to end the war in the United States Congress. The Confederate and Union armies moving northward were roughly paralleling each other, but a small contingent of Confederates, acting on a rumor of a large supply of shoes near the town of Gettysburg, veered off and happened to encounter a small group of Union cavalry. The Union forces were outnumbered and were driven southward to Cemetery Ridge before they halted their retreat. On July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the battle, after having received numerous reinforcements, Lee ordered his divisions to attack. The Big Round Top and Little Round Top were nearby hills that had been left unprotected. If the Confederates could take these positions, they could surround Union forces. But Union reinforcements to that location arrived just in time to prevent that from happening, to prevent the Round Tops from falling to the charging Confederates. The fighting on that second day was some of the fiercest in the campaign thus far, but was ultimately not successful. Holding off that Confederate attack likely saved the entire Union army. As Lee was determined to come away with a win, he ordered a major assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. But first, there would be nearly 1,000 yards of open ground to cross. More than 14,000 Confederate soldiers under the command of General George Pickett began their famous charge across 3/4 of a mile of open field to attack the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. But few of the Confederate soldiers actually made it across. Lee's attempt for a decisive victory in Pennsylvania had failed, and he had lost approximately 28,000 troops, 1/3 of his army. Union losses were almost as high. Gettysburg would turn out to be the bloodiest battle ever fought by American soldiers. After such a tremendous defeat, the likelihood of Southern recognition by any foreign government was just about non-existent. The war did continue for 2 more years, but Gettysburg marked the end of Lee's major offenses, and he would never again win a major significant battle. It was also quickly becoming apparent that the long-term nature of the war was finally catching up with the Confederacy. And simultaneous with the march into the north, a Union army in the west had laid siege to the important city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The city of Vicksburg had been under siege for about 6 weeks. It was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. But just 1 day after the disaster at Gettysburg, Vicksburg too fell to Union forces. This would effectively split the South in two by cutting off the farmland in Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, which was now growing a large proportion of the Confederacy's food from the rest of the territory. At this point, Lincoln and his military commanders could make plans to win the war. By early 1864, the Union had full control of the Mississippi River and had completed its goal of blockading the Confederate coastline, preventing any meaningful foreign aid. Grant's success at Vicksburg led to his being appointed as the overall Union commander in the spring of '64. He would then relocate to the eastern theater of war to pursue Lee. Grant's plan to win the war was to launch several simultaneous offensives. He hoped to drive Lee and the other Confederate armies into exhaustion, forcing them to use up valuable resources and to even divide their troops to try and meet all of the challenges at once. Grant didn't object to high losses amongst his own men, knowing he could afford to replace them. All that mattered was defeating Lee. Their first encounter was at the Battle of the Wilderness, and 28,000 soldiers were casualties in May of 1864. Just a few days later, another 28,000 soldiers were casualties in the Battle of Spotsylvania. More than 2/3 of those casualties of those 2 battles were Union soldiers. At Cold Harbor, just a few weeks later, Grant lost another 13,000 soldiers, 7,000 of them in just 30 minutes. In the 30 days that Grant had been fighting Lee in Virginia, May and early June of 1864, he had lost between 50 and 60,000 men, a number roughly equal to the size of the Confederate Army at the time. As a result, Grant became known as the Butcher. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman led the Union Army across the South with the goal of striking the heart of the South, moving eastward from Vicksburg, inflicting as much damage as he could against the war resources, all the way to Atlanta. He was successful in his march, forcing Jefferson Davis to make command changes of his own. Sherman hoped that by bringing the war not just to the soldiers, but to the civilian population, that he could wear down the Confederacy even faster. By August of 1864, he had reached the outskirts of the major city of Atlanta, the biggest railroad hub in the South, and had begun a siege. Rather than just sit and wait, though, Sherman continued his attacks and soon severed rail lines that supplied the Confederates in the area with much-needed supplies. With the fall of the rail lines supplying the city, Confederate General John Hood had no choice but to abandon the city and withdraw. Hood pulled his troops out of Atlanta on September 1st, 1864, destroying supply depots as he left to prevent them from falling into Union hands. He also set fire to 81 loaded train cars full of ammunition, creating a massive fire watched by thousands of both soldiers and civilians, ammunition that was meant for the front. The damage was enormous, and with no opposition, Sherman and his troops marched into Atlanta on the 2nd of September. He remained in Atlanta for approximately 2 months, using it as a temporary headquarters while he waited for the results of the political battle going on further to the north in Washington, D.C. The political battle was the hotly contested election of 1864 that pitted General George McClellan, who advocated bringing the war to a close and negotiating peace, against Lincoln, who still hoped to win the war. In the months leading to the election, Lincoln actually expected to lose, as Northern civilians seemed to be growing weary of the high number of casualties and how the war appeared to be dragging on with no end in sight. The capture of Atlanta boosted Union morale and helped give Lincoln the edge in the election, winning all but 3 Union states, though the popular vote was a lot closer than the electoral vote. Just a few days after Lincoln's victory in the election, General Sherman prepared to leave Atlanta, torching the city to leave nothing behind for the Confederates to come back to once he'd gone. More than 3,000 buildings, including businesses, hospitals, homes, and schools, would be destroyed. As Atlanta lay smoldering, Sherman and his troops began their audacious and infamous March to the Sea, a massive scorched earth campaign that ended in the port city of Savannah, Georgia, on December 21st. There was really little the Confederates could to stop Sherman and his men, as he cut a 60-mile-wide swath through the South from Atlanta to Savannah, 285-mile trek, destroying everything in his path. He even had his men sow salt in the fields to kill crops and to prevent regrowth for years to come. His soldiers pillaged the countryside, destroying everything that could conceivably have military value. The march became legendary for the misery that created amongst the civilian population, both whites and slaves, holding great resentment toward Sherman. 3 days before Christmas, Sherman sent a message to Lincoln pronouncing the city his Christmas gift to the president. Lincoln, who had been worried about Sherman's tactics, especially of him essentially dropping out of communication so that he couldn't be tracked by the Confederates, replied that he was pleased. "Nothing risked, nothing gained," he told Sherman. The pillaging of the countryside created extreme misery, destroyed plantation houses, rail lines torn up. The iron rails heated and wrapped around trees in what were being called Sherman's neckties or Sherman's donuts, preventing the South from easily rebuilding. They would need a blast furnace to completely remelt the iron rails, something that they really didn't have access to. With no opposition in Savannah, Sherman planned to turn his march northward, with the goal of eventually meeting up with Grant in order to take on Lee. That march northward, once he did get moving, was similarly destructive. And though he never actually connected with Grant's army, he did end up forcing the surrender of General Joseph Johnston's troops after a 2-month campaign. Many of the major port cities along the coast were the target of the march northward, and the destruction of them by Union artillery and naval vessels was significant. For example, approximately 2/3 of the city of Columbia, South Carolina would be destroyed in the shelling. Charleston fared nearly as badly. The city had actually been under attack off and on for 587 days, when General Beauregard finally ordered the remaining Confederate forces to evacuate in February of 1865. In the meantime, much of the city was destroyed, including Fort Sumter. When the Union Army finally marched into the city of Charleston, the first U.S. soldiers to enter were members of the 55th Massachusetts Infantry and the 21st Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops, both regiments made up entirely of African American soldiers. The symbolism was not lost on General Sherman. Robert E. Lee's armies, thinned by desertion as well as casualties, was now much smaller than Grant's. There was one last Confederate attempt to break the Union hold on the area around Richmond, at Petersburg, at the failed Battle of Five Forks. But the Confederates failed. The Union essentially controlled the entire area surrounding Richmond and Petersburg, cutting it off from the rest of the Confederacy. And remember, Richmond is the capital. Realizing that the capital was now lost, and with the evacuation of the Confederate government, Jefferson Davis and others fleeing, Lee decided it was time to evacuate his army. As he headed westward, he hadn't intended to surrender, but instead to retrieve supplies that were supposed to be waiting for him at Appomattox. Instead, Grant got ahead of him, and when Lee arrived, found himself completely surrounded. Faced with no other options, he surrendered. In an untraditional gesture, and as a sign of Grant's respect and anticipation of peacefully restoring the Confederate States to the Union, Lee was permitted to keep his sword and his horse Traveler. His officers permitted to keep their sidearms. And the troops would not be held as POWs, but would instead be paroled and sent home. Technically, Johnston's troops were still fighting further to the south, but they too would surrender within a couple of weeks. As Lee was in charge of the entire Confederate army, when he surrendered, the war was effectively over. Days after the surrender of Lee's forces, Lincoln decided to take a break from the difficulties of leadership and take his wife to see the play Our American Cousin at nearby Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Initially, Ulysses S. Grant was to attend with the president, but plans changed, and instead he was traveling by train to New Jersey. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor admired by the president, had abandoned a plan to kidnap Lincoln and instead had helped to develop a drastic assassination plot to kill Lincoln, as well as other Union leaders, and to revive the Confederate cause. He was able to gain access to the theater and snuck into the president's box, where he shot him with a small handgun at a moment in the play when the audience would be responding with laughter to a particular line, effectively covering the sound of the shot. Booth then leapt onto the stage from the box, shouting something to the audience, who initially thought it was part of the production. There is disagreement about what exactly he said, with traditional reports being sic semper tyrannis, but the screams of Mary Lincoln caused pandemonium to break out, and the audience quickly realized this was not part of the performance. Though injured in his leap onto the stage, breaking one of the bones in his lower leg, Booth made it to his horse and fled into the Maryland countryside, where he remained in hiding until he could cross over into Virginia, where he expected a hero's welcome. But that isn't what he received. He would be tracked and eventually cornered in a barn, where he was shot and killed. A bullet through the neck. The investigation into his activities revealed a larger plot that included a plan to assassinate not only Lincoln, but Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, as well as General Grant. Johnson's assigned assassin had actually failed to act. Seward's managed to get into his home, attacking him, stabbing him multiple times. But bandages and braces from a carriage accident a couple of weeks earlier actually saved his life. Grant, of course, was on a train to New Jersey, and therefore out of reach. As for Lincoln, the bullet entered his head just behind his left ear, tore through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. The injury was mortal. He was too unstable to move to the White House, so he was brought to a nearby boarding house, where he died early the following morning. Lincoln would be mourned by both the North and the South. A train carrying his body traveled an extensive path back home, stopping in New York City and many of other northern cities, before it eventually reached Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried. A mourning nation turned out by the hundreds of thousands to say goodbye to their president, the first to fall to an assassin's bullet. Most of Booth's co-conspirators were arrested within a month. 8 were tried before a military tribunal. All were found guilty, including the doctor that had set Booth's broken leg after he had escaped into the countryside. 4 were sentenced to death, 3 to life in prison, and 1 to a term of 6 years. Of the 3 who were still in prison in 1869, they would receive a pardon from President Johnson, and that did include the doctor. The war had resulted in the loss of over 500,000 men. 1 out of 4 Southern men were killed, and almost as many wounded. With so much of the South's wealth invested in slaves, and those slaves now gone, ran away, confiscated by the army, or killed, the Southern economy had simply collapsed. All of the gold that had existed had been spent, and the currency of the Confederacy, printed by the now defunct Confederate government, was worthless. Cities across the South were in ruin, destroyed by the Union or the Confederates. Railroads were burned, disassembled, or otherwise destroyed, and would take years to rebuild. Rural areas were also hit hard as farm fields had become battlefields. And of course, on General Sherman's march across the South, that salt spread on the fields would prevent any new crops from being grown. That effect would last for years. With no labor available and land that couldn't grow crops, farm prices collapsed. In some places, the value of farms declining by as much as 90%. In the meantime, the northern economy began to grow, began to boom. They were on the cusp of a second industrial revolution. But the South was left behind.